The 2025 ECPR General Conference in Thessaloniki gathered scholars from across Europe to explore the most pressing challenges facing democracy today. At this conference, Pledge coordinated a special panel titled The Emotional Foundations of Grievance Politics, bringing together researchers to examine how resentment, blame, and disillusionment are transforming political life. We took the opportunity to meet with Professor Teresa Capellos, a leading expert in political psychology and one of the key contributors to the Pledge project, to learn more about Pledge and to better understand why grievances and emotions may now be one of the most powerful forces shaping our democracies.
So it's a good question, because Pledge came out of the need to try to understand the more combative, the more angry side of political engagement these days. And one of the issues that we had at the beginning was that a lot of what we see in everyday communications and also the way citizens react to political issues and political leaders was identified as anger. And when we started mapping the emotional profile, the psychological profile of anger, we started noticing that it didn't really fit the criteria of what you would identify as an angry citizen. Although we had this caveat that the citizens themselves were self-identifying as angry, and then academic scholarship and journalists and the whole political debate was all about anger. So it started almost as a bet to try to see mapping the psychological profile of these responses to political phenomena to see if they actually meet the criteria, the psychological criteria that you would assign to anger, or the phenomenon was different. So what we started finding out in this process of measuring and studying it and collecting data is that people's responses were qualitatively different to what you would identify as anger. They had an element of powerlessness. They had an element of vindictiveness. So it was not just the simple anger expression on a particular topic that would dissipate, but there was also long-standing anger that mirrored a deep frustration that was also then not having the agency that you would expect to take action, activism, to engage in political behaviors, support actions that would change your position or improve your the conditions that would stimulate your grievance, but it was more a passive type of anger that was vented outwards as hatred towards others, but did not have any pragmatic implications for the object of anger itself. So it would not come with social change. So when we started looking at how this fits psychologically, we started coming across literature that was highlighting a different emotional experience, and that we have then since identified as the emotional mechanism of ressentiment, which is a really complex emotional system, if you will, that engages with input emotions like anger, but also this inefficacious anger that we would see, but also envy and shame and humiliation. So really difficult affective experiences that many people either didn't want to recognize in themselves, didn't want to recognize in others, but also would mislabel them themselves as anger, although it was not the prototypical anger that you would expect to find. And then there were outputs connected to this mechanism or to this process that we would see that were consistently similar. They had to do with outgroup hatred, they had to do with morally righteous victimhood, it had to do with vindictiveness, right? Desire for revenge, that again didn't fit the simple psychological profile you would expect with anger. When you're angry about something, you do something and it goes away. So we started kind of connecting the dots and looking at interviews. The first project that we did before even Pledge started was coding interviews of citizens that were self-identifying as angry and mapping their psychological footprint. And what we increasingly found was that it was ressentiment. So then the big challenge became, can we unpack this process? Can we find how ressentiment fits into this system of grievance politics where people engage with politics mainly through their grievances? Step one, is ressentiment the affective undercurrent of this process? What else goes hand in hand with it? So then we started looking at reactionary orientations as systems of thought that have to do with the desire to turn things back without necessarily implementing constructive changes, pro-social changes forward. It was more backward looking, almost like tripping yourself rather than trying to identify a path forward. And then also we started looking at the types of connections that people develop when they go through this process, because very often you don't go through this alone, but you go through it with others that you identify in the same group with, or others whose group you want to join. And then we started looking at the social bonds in that space, and we found that the bonds there were not what we would expect from a social identity perspective, the tight bonds of a group that you identify with, where you feel solidarity and you care for the other. But it was more narcissistic type of bonds, that people cared more about the image of the group rather than the substantive values of the group. And they cared more about how they would be represented rather than what they would represent. So that invited us to create a system of understanding this phenomena through the affective mechanism of ressentiment that has elements in it as victimhood identities that we have been discussing at the conference, elements like reactionary orientations, the affective undercurrents of ressentiment, and the other relationship with emotions that we have been discussing for a long time, like pride and hubris and blame and blaming, and how that fits in the whole ecosystem of understanding grievance politics, both affectively and cognitively, motivationally, ideologically. We have been theorizing of it as something new that goes hand in hand with ressentiment and collective narcissism and these reactionary trends that we see. Whether we have had grievance politics in the past is another really big question that perhaps requires different, more historical account of political processes. But what we see now is that the old models of understanding political behavior that were resting on ideological attachments, like am I on the left or am I on the right? Models that looked at party identification, I identify as voter of this group versus the other. Models that are looking at leadership attachments, how people follow a particular leader. Models that look at personality characteristics on their own do not predict well. They don't make sense. They give us only a very partial account. The same thing happens with models that look at economic voting, or models that look at issue voting more broadly beyond the economy, right? Or the pocketbook hypothesis, I vote on behalf of my own economic interests. The difference in grievance politics is that there is a little bit of all that in there, but the fundamental principle by which you make a decision in politics is your grievance. And that grievance can be temporary, and it can change from one month to the other. But it gives you a hook, almost like an anchor, on the basis of which you orient who you're going to vote for. So it becomes a very cursory way of relating to political outcomes, but through a very fundamentally core emotional response, which is ressentiment. So what you would see in grievance politics is the emotion being consistently there. People who self-identify as angry, that are, in terms of emotional footprint, ressentimentful or in ressentiment, although their grievances can change, or they can have multiple grievances, or they can have like a cluster of grievances, what we have studied as anti-preferences. And when you engage with them a little bit deeper to try to understand whether they want to solve their grievances or not, they don't have a way to reach those solutions. And sometimes the solutions seem irrelevant to them. They just want to voice the grievance. They want to be together with other people that have the same grievance. And then even when they're together with these people, they don't seem to bond with these people. There's no connecting thread apart from the grievance itself. Once they moved on to a different grievance, they connect with a different group. So they are themselves unhinged, unattached. They can be temporarily attached. They don't have ideological grounding. They don't have attachment to a specific leader in the long term. It's only the characteristics of the leader and their narcissistic attachments, their introjections of that leader that keep them going. If the leader betrays what they believe would benefit their group, the leader goes. So it's a really precarious way of attaching to politics. And it's also a way that does not provide a way to solve your problem, but it gives you like a temporary patch to vent it out, to find a target, to externalize the blame, not being able to hold the blame, splitting the world in all good me, all good us, to all bad them, all good they, all bad they, and then really navigating through the system in a really inefficacious way because it doesn't produce any outcomes. It's just your grievance is maintained. You almost want to keep it there, so it keeps you going because you don't have very much else to go on. It's a different way of engaging in the sense that, so I think there many ways to think about it. If we don't study it properly, and we treat it as something else, if we dismiss it, if we think of it as a war of ideologies or just the problem about populism, and we don't see it for what it is, then we mislabel it, then we cannot tackle it properly. The deeper problem with grievance politics is that it's anti-political. It's void of political engagement. It doesn't work with the fundamental principles of politics in terms of ideology, constraint, things that matter to you in the long run, connecting with other people that have the same passions in a way. They're very ephemeral in terms of their particular focus, but they are toxic in terms of their emotional experience. So in the long term, they produce harm for the individuals that engage in grievance politics because they are not in a very happy place. They can be in a healthy democratic system, but if they approach it through grievances, they fail to see the benefits of that system. They only focus on the negatives, they focus on the grievances. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way of not appreciating, not having gratitude of the good things that you have, and not having the resolve to improve the things that worry you. Now, fundamentally, politics is oriented around those two main axes of appreciating the good of the political system you engage in, and then striving to improve. In grievance politics, none of this happens. You are disappreciating. Yeah, you don't experience gratitude, therefore you are not pro-social, and at the same time you don't improve your situation because it is an environment where powerlessness is constantly shuffled around and not encouraged but promoted in a way, so nothing ever changes. So there are challenges in this way because you're operating outside the principles that you would consider fundamental for democratic engagement, which involves responsibility and action.